Hello, my name is Raquel. I go by Raquel B across the internets, and welcome to another art video. In this art video, we're going to be going over part 2 of creating a fairy illustration. In part 1, I show how I drew the sketch for the final image and did a color test to select the color schemes of the final illustration. You can see these processes in full in part 1, linked in the description. In this video, or in part 2, I will be exploring which medium I will use for the final illustration through subject studies. Subject studies are small images or thumbs used to practice different rendering techniques. For me, these are different than color tests. Color tests are small images that have much less detail and prioritize basic shapes for the sake of comparison of different color schemes. In subject studies, I fully render a small painting in multiple ways in efforts to gain clarity for the larger image. I have made 2 subject studies in this video, the first being in watercolor and the second being in gouache, with the overall goal of depicting the fruit as glowing or illuminated from within. So join me as I go through each of my techniques for these mediums and compare their pros and cons. Let's get started. Subject Study 1. Watercolor. Typically, I follow the same process for when I use watercolor. The first is usually a light sketch, this time in pen, like a ballpoint pen. The second is an underpainting using the undertones of the subject I'm trying to depict. In this case, I'm making it yellow to give that luminosity because it's going to be a yellowish light. And then the third would be local color while preserving the highlights because watercolor is a transparent medium. And then the fourth would be shadows. So anything, whether it's form shadows and cast shadows, to create and render the form. With working in watercolor, it's typical for me to work from light to dark because watercolor is a transparent medium, which means that every layer underneath will affect the layer above it, and it's less forgiving and you can't erase when you are trying to make your mark. So if you go too dark too soon, it could cause or have issues. So it's easier to work from light to dark to better refine as you go so that when you're getting to the detail stage, it is more dark. And so you actually have less of a chance to put things in the wrong spot. At least that's how I view it. As I go through these different stages of the watercolor process, I also up the saturation of my washes. So because it's staining paper, the washes you use, as you can see here, they're very light because that's the beginning stages. Now, as I go forward in the process, I start to make them darker and more saturated, meaning there is more pigment to water ratio. And you can see here how it's more pigmented and it's reinforcing that orange that I had placed down. I jump around the image when I'm doing watercolor because it helps me have control over the wetness of the paper. The wetness of the paper dictates what kind of edges you'll produce as you paint or add washes to the paper. To have or make a lost edge or something that has a soft gradient with no edges at all, the paper must be some type of very damp or wet, because pigments will then spread to where the water is, blurring the edges. And this is what is called the wet on wet method because your brush is wet and the paper is wet. To have a hard edge, the paper must be dry or near dry so that when the wash is added from your wet brush to the dry paper, the pigment doesn't spread beyond the mark itself because the paper is dry. Again, because the pigment only goes to where there is wetness or water because it is a water-soluble medium. So then, because that pigment didn't travel, it follows the line of demarcation, and that is the hard edge that you see there. And that is what we call wet on dry. So to control the edges is about the wetness of your paper and the saturation of the washes and your timing. An advanced move, which you just saw me produce, is to paint on nearly dry paper to get a hard edge, then immediately follow with a damp brush that's clean with no pigment, just water to blur the edges. So you're making a softer edge. Wet on wet and dry on dry aren't the only options for making marks with watercolor, but those are the basics. From there, with practice, you can explore the different drying times and states of the paper compared to layering and different saturations of washes to produce different textures and results. That's what makes it more advanced. Doing advanced techniques, you have to have an awareness of your paper and the different areas of your paper that are dry versus damp versus wet. The lantern fruit I had just painted, so it is very wet, but the background was dry. And so while I'm waiting for the lantern fruit to dry so I can add its detail, I moved on to the background. You can see here I'm using hard edges. So the paper is dry. I'm adding this bluish green to the background because I know that's the color I wanted for my background. And I am tickling in the edges, leaving the hard like swipes instead of blurring them to denote the light rays or the luminosity that I'm trying to capture, because it's going to override what is there in the background. Because if you've ever like looked at a light, the immediate background that's right next to it is hard to see from the light itself, so it's going to kind of blur it out or blind it out, I guess is the word. So I'm trying to mimic that in the render by having these hard-edged sketchy lines. I also have a paper that's a napkin that is nearby, and that's for me, again, for the control of the water and the wetness. I will dap off my brush because there's too much water on my brush. It can affect the brush strokes. Or if there's there's too much color, or I'm trying to switch colors, you want to dap it off too. Now I'm going back in, and this is wet on wet, because now that I have the cool green in there, I wanted to make it a little bit darker just on the edges so we get a fade, but I didn't want it to be like a harsh line. So if I don't want a harsh line, you have to work wet into wet. And I mixed the green with a little bit of red because of color theory, and red is the complementary color of green, so it will neutralize it and make it more gray. But because both the red is hypersaturated and the green are hypersaturated, when mixed together, the neutralization gets you to a near black instead of a gray or a lighter tone. And it looks like now I'm mixing up I'm mixing up an orange, so that means that my lantern fruit is probably dry enough for me to work on, and it is. See how the pigment here is not spreading, and that we have a nice hard edge, except for certain points. So the paper is probably a little bit damp in areas, but it's not super important at this point because I know I'm going to be layering on more. And this is because I don't really do alla prima or direct painting. My style has many layers, so that is an indirect painting. And so I know that these brush strokes aren't going to be the final ones, so I'm careful and I try to plan them out, but it doesn't have to be exactly precise in this style that I'm doing. You will also notice that the whole time I am painting in watercolor, I am preserving the center to preserve the illusion of a luminosity, because lantern fruits are a real fruit, but they don't glow in the dark. But I was like, if I'm going to do something fantasy, something magical, it's a lantern fruit. Like, that's an easy one. So I was like, let's make it actually act like a lantern. Oh my goodness. And maybe that's what fairies use in their little village to light it up, is these fruit, like these lantern fruit. Like, they don't have like oil lamps. No. They get lantern fruit berries and grow them because magic. Now you can see here I'm going back because the paper again doesn't dry that fast, and I was telling the advanced technique. I'm going back with a cleaner brush and blurring out one edge, just that one edge. Then the other hard edge remains so that I can better depict the ridges of this fruit. A thing that was also tricky for me was painting something from my mind while using references, because I had to look up lantern fruit, but also look up what lanterns look like illuminated, and then try to mash them together so I can get the correct lighting scenario. And I noticed that with lanterns, or at least paper lanterns, when they're lit from within or they're on, there's not a whole lot of form shadows to them because they are the light source. What the form is its outer like structure and vibrancy, and that's it. And when I say form shadows, if you can see on these berries how there is like a light source and then you have a form shadow that informs you that this is a sphere and that darkness that wraps around the back. When a lantern's on, if it's round, it doesn't have that. And I'm used to depicting stuff as that, and I'm realizing now that's because I'm used to depicting subjects underneath or being subjected to a light source instead of being the light source. And so this is me painting the light source within the painting, and I have to keep that in consideration. And so that was a part of the experiment, and I think it was somewhat successful. So I'm now reinforcing that shadow to better depict that this is where the light's going, this is what's happening. I will add though, on these berries I did lose their highlights, and so it is a little bit of a muddy mess on the berries. I did kind of get impatient with them, and the paper was too wet, so there was a lot of bleeding between the hard edges, and so they just didn't exist anymore and were more like firm or soft edges, and that's why they are not as crisp as I would like. And so it is that portion of the image has less clarity. And now I am going back through and adding more washes of a darker, deeper background color, and doing that a more advanced technique once again of laying down the color, dipping my brush into the water to make it less saturated than the original wash, and then tickling that in to give it some kind of gradation in softness, but not too soft, because I want the luminosity to have that rounded kind of shape, or something that indicates like it's radiating from the center. And then I also glazed over the berries once more, because when I was looking at them, they looked too close to the lantern fruit itself in hue, or like hue is the color. So the lantern fruit was like a red orange, or like more of a yellow, like orange, not a red orange. And then so were the berries, and I wanted those to be a little bit more red in hue, so I glazed over them with a red. And now you can see I am mixing the orange color with a little bit of green, because it's like a red orange-ish. I'm going back and forth now. But it just helped desaturate it or make it darker without adding black. And then I made it thin because I was going to do glazes for the texture, because the textures, this was an experiment, and I was like, I don't think that texture is so prominent that it's going to be super dark, but is going to add that veiny texture of the leaves onto it. So I added a glaze that's a little bit darker, a little less saturated to denote it. Now on to subject study 2, which is gouache. You can see here, this is my gouache paint palette. I have a tiny little napkin on here that I've used over and over and over again, and I just dunked it into the water to keep it wet. It helps the paints themselves stay wetter longer, and because it's gouache, it will reconstitute, so I just haven't thrown it away. I usually will use that same piece of paper or napkin until it disintegrates and is non-usable. And then you see I added some yellow to the actual palette, because that it was just impossible. My gouache process usually follows the same 5 steps, working from thin paint to thick paint along the stages. So the first stage is a basic sketch, like how I start any painting, and I expect this to be covered, and I usually use ballpoint pen. I'm not as precious with the sketches in gouache that I am in watercolor, because with watercolor, if there's too much graphite or if there's too much of a sketch there, it can muddle the image and it's not going to be covered up. It will actually show up in the final image. But with gouache, I don't have to worry about that. Then on to phase 2 or step 2, I do a thin wash of color, usually a gray tone, which is, I didn't capture that on video here. I thought I was recording and didn't, but it is the ones I do for denoting the values scale of the image. So I'll go through and try to mark out the shadows, the light sources, and the basic forms of the shape, just to remind myself as I am working. And then for step 3, I apply local colors. And that is with a thin yet opaque kind of consistency with my paint, and the gradients and I work the gradients in between of like working dark to light. So you can see here on this lantern fruit, I started with the darkest portions, which would be the folds or the ridges, and I worked into the lighter portions, which are that in between kind of fleshy part. In step 3, I will work to fill all of the subjects with their local color until the page is filled with color. Then in step 4, the image should be filled, and I start to work on then the medium details, or like the medium size shapes. So we're working from the principle of big, medium, and small, and that's with slightly thicker paint. I'll also use that opportunity to blend or soften certain edges if needed to be, and reinforce shadows. And then step 5 is usually the last step, and that is where I do the smaller details, such as highlights, refine the smaller minute textures of a given object, and also correct any silhouette needs, like refine the edge of like silhouettes and the overall shapes of things. And then I'll give it an overview and look to see if I have the contrast that I want, where I want it to be, so that my values are where I want to be. I've noticed in my own painting, after I've done so many paintings, that a lot of my paintings do tend to lean more towards the light and lacked contrast in dark. So I use that opportunity in my last stages to go back and maybe add some more darker hues or darker values if need be. Now, I do love using wash. I am still refining my process because I haven't used it as long as I have used watercolors. For reference, I have been painting with watercolors for about 15 years, and for gouache, I've recently picked it up in the last 2 to 3 years. Gouache and watercolor are very similar because they are both water soluble and use a similar binders to make the paint, which I believe is gum arabic. In fact, you can get gouache to act like watercolor or very similar to it, as long as it is watered down and made into washes, meaning that the saturation of pigments to water ratio is not that high. For this reason, a lot of my gouache process, the initial steps, look very similar to watercolor because it is my old habits kind of sneaking in to this new painting process. The main difference between gouache and watercolor is that gouache has opacity and also the paint is buildable. I would not recommend building a thick impasto with gouache though. It's not acrylic, because acrylic is more of like a polymer and plasticine, so that means it has flexibility. Also, oil paints have flexibility. But with gouache, if you do it too thickly or apply it too much, and as it dries, it can be liable to crack. So it does have good benefits of its opacity, and then you can layer them. That's why I'm not worried about being precious about the center of this lantern fruit like I was before with the watercolor study. But at the same time, you don't want to go too thick, or it can cause issues for the longevity of your painting or image overall. Along with that difference is the edge control, because now the edge control is less dependent upon the wetness of the paper, but instead about the thickness of the paint. In general, I do work from thin to thick. And then you can, as the paint gets a little bit thicker, and I'm saying minutely thicker, you can actually feather in edges and kind of combine edges, or, you know, add more details. I have noticed when other painters use gouache, they don't blend as much, and they'll do a lot of applied different shapes and then kind of layer them over together, like puzzle piece it with the different highlights, and it becomes very graphic. And I think that style is very beautiful, but that's not how my approach. I like to have a blended approach. And the reason why also too is because gouache, that when it dries, unless you're using acrylic gouache, which is a different type of gouache, it can be reconstituted like watercolor. So if you have layers of paint and then you put another layer on top, eventually you'll disturb the layer underneath if you do too much. And so it's easier to just layer graphic shapes on top of each other without the expectation of blending, versus blending it together or trying to treat it like you would with other mediums or other paint. And I like to try and do a little bit of both worlds by having it kind of on the thinner side and blending in the edges, but still layering at the same time. You can see this here. I've layered over the now highlight, that light source for the painting, with the white and the yellow. The yellow in what the yellow paint is not as opaque as the titanium white I am using. And I'm sorry, I don't know why I said it like that. I'm not above being influenced. And then I kind of tap it in, and it lays it down. And then once I lay it down, I go back and I don't add more paint. My brush is just damp, and I'm actually disturbing the layers underneath to kind of blend it into the painting, versus it just being kind of placed over it like a sticker. I have also found that because of this opacity, that you can get more refined, more crisp edges when painting with gouache versus what you could get with watercolor. I will say that I am liking the textures of the foliage that I was able to get in this gouache rendering than of the background of the watercolors. The watercolors were really just soft, and I probably could reproduce it with watercolor, but I just was so focused on trying to get the radiance that I neglected to try and give shape or form to the background. And right now here I am reinforcing the different edges to make it feel like it has those ridges and those creases. And now I'm adding more highlights. It is buildable. And that's one of the main differences between gouache, because of its opacity and its lack of transparency. You can build back your highlights. When it comes to gouache, the brightest thing on the image is no longer just going to be the white paper. Now, sometimes I can say that, depending on what my palette is looking like, it might still be the paper is going to be the brightest white portion because the palette is contaminated, because I still use, you see the pan over there, I use the same setup every time. But eventually I will clean it out. And I have found, because it's reconstitutable, I just find like I don't want to waste the paints. In all honesty, every time I start a painting, if this palette, I don't clean out the palette. Instead, this probably is what has informed my process. Instead, I will add water and then swirl that mixing area around until it becomes desaturated, browny, sometimes bluey, purpley mess, and then use that as my underpainting for the values. That way I'm not wasting any paint that I had from the color mixes before, because it reconstitutes. And so right now I am going in and I am on the second layer of, or the second stage. Was it the second stage? Yeah, it was like the third stage of like reinforcing the forms, using thicker paint to reinforce the forms, the berries. I think it should also be noted that when I work in gouache, I have to hop around the page less because I'm less dependent upon the drying times. Now, it's not to say that I am not paying attention to them at all, because again, it is a water soluble medium. So if you work on damp or wet paper, the paint might move and not go where you want it to go, and it can mess with your edge control, which is important for depicting form and completing the illusion of the painting or image you're trying to complete. But because gouache is opaque and you don't have to use as much water, and I can play around with its thickness, I usually will work on a subject until its stage of completion and then move on, like the completion of that particular stage, and then move on to another subject, right? So like I do stage 1 altogether, stage 2 of filling in the stage 1 is the sketch, stage 2 is the values, and so stage 3 is local colors. So I'll fill in the local colors, considering, the values and light and versus darks or shadows, for a subject fully until that area is a little bit too wet to work with and I need to add more layers. That's the difference, because with watercolor I can't do both the shadows and the highlights at the same time, because they can kind of just blend into each other or just cause issues for clarity of the image. I will also say that both gouache and watercolor have a tendency to dry a bit lighter, or not the same value as you have painted them. And so that's why I do multiple layers, because I am adjusting as it dries so that the final dried image is where I want it to be, versus just like putting down something wet and I'm like, that's good, and then I'm like, I know it's not going to be, because it's going to shift once it dries. So I go back and just constantly I am adjusting for the color as the painting dries. And luckily, unlike oils, I don't have to wait that long for it to cure, and so it's literally within the same paint session. Also, another thing to consider when you're working with mediums that are heavily dependent upon water or the dryness of things is consider your environment. I live in a dry, arid state. It's dry here. So my dry times, even in the winter, because my heater's going and that circulates the dry air, like I need to actually buy a humidifier. My dry times between these layers, not that long. It does not take me forever. But if you live in a very humid place, you might have an issue with that, and you might have to incorporate like a hair dryer or a fan to speed up the process of just waiting for your stuff to dry between layers. I've also heard some artists say that like if they use a blow dryer, they tend to not like it because it can mess with the pigment in some way. I wouldn't know. I haven't had to use a blow dryer like that, really, because of how dry it is where I live. So you can see here now I'm on the final stages here, and I'm using the same brush fully for this rendering, It's just, I think, a number 8 round that gets to a really, really fine point. And that's why I like round brushes, because depending on your pressure, you can get big swatches versus big marks versus tiny fine marks. I don't really switch to anything else. There's not really a need to. So I'm going in and I'm adding highlights. And when I do highlights, I first start out with them being more of a kind of glaze situation, so thinner consistency, just to go over and not fully block out what is underneath with complete stark white. And really, I also tint it. I tint the white to be like a pastel of the local color that I'm covering, if that makes sense, or to match the light source versus it just being a stark white highlight like it's in a cartoon. I tend to like it to be a little bit more tinted to match whatever is the item it's or object it's reflecting off of, because I just like the way that looks, I think. That's why I do it. I've experimented with just doing pure white, and I'm like, it's always a little bit just too harsh for what I'm going for. And you'll see here too, I'll go in with my fingers to help smudge things and soften the edge. You can do that, and it works. And it works really because of the opaqueness of the paint. I usually don't use my fingers when using watercolor because of it's so watery, it really doesn't do anything. But because of this thickness, and I'm using the paint now near down out of the tube as I up the ante on the highlights, it has a viscosity that can be moved with my fingers. Now, I will say overall, because we're coming close to the end here, that between the two images, I actually like both. It wasn't is this right or wrong? It was more of that I'm trying to come up with clarity and have a game plan before I go to the final image. And I now do. So I like the background in the berries in gouache, but I prefer the lightness and the transparency, the translucency of the watercolor. I think the watercolor better mimics light being inside an object with translucency, which is what I'm trying to go for these images. I want it to be akin to paper lanterns that you see in the wild. Not the wild. Paper lanterns are man-made. Oh my God, girl. But that's what I'm going for. And I think also too, the different rendering styles will add to the contrast and understanding of the subjects. I feel like doing a more translucent style on the lantern fruit will bring them more forward as the focal point, and then everything else within the image, the fairies, the foliage, all of that, I will do more opaquely, but because they'll be more analogous, it will push them back, in my opinion, and hopefully give you that contrast and make it more, yeah, more what I want in my mind's eye, because this image doesn't exist anywhere. I'm not making, this is not, I have references, but I'm not doing a one-to-one pull from a photograph. I'm making up the image. I was like, ooh, let me make something fun and fancy and free. And again, like I said, I'm always adjusting for the darks. And you can also glaze over gouache as I did watercolor. So, because I also work so thinly, and like I don't work too thick to begin with, I don't have that issue of being concerned with like fat over lean, because it's not too thick. It's just, I work with paint that's just thick enough to be opaque and maybe a little bit more, but not beyond that. So me doing a thin glaze over already existing washes or laid down paint in gouache is not too much of a concern, at least for my rendering style. Each of these subject studies took me about, I want to say 40 minutes. So the watercolor one, I think, took me about 25. And then this gouache one took me about 35 to 40. And ooh, look at I love peeling back the paint, the tape. That's my favorite part. It's so satisfying. Look at that edge. Oh, so good. Crispy edge. This is some washi tape that I bought from Joann's. It was like in a big tube of them. And I just take that in my traveling paint like setup. All right. These are the finished painting studies. Subscribe so you can get notified for part 3, where I will finally paint the final image. Oh, good Lord. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Bye!